the gates were already open. Nadia sat with the engine idling, headlights washing over the iron latticework, and told herself it meant nothing. Estates had automatic timers. Caretakers forgot to lock things. There were 100 explanations that did not require her to feel the specific unease currently moving up the back of her neck like a cold finger. She drove through. The road from the gates to the house was longer than she expected. A quarter-mile of gravel threading between old-growth gorse and sea grass that leaned inland in the wind, all of it silver-gray in the headlights, all of it moving. The Atlantic was audible before it was visible, a low, rhythmic insistence beneath everything, the way a heartbeat is audible in certain kinds of silence. Ironcliff announced itself the way old houses do, not all at once, but in stages. A chimney stack first. Then the roofline, uneven against the clouded sky. Then the full face of it, black stone, 3 stories, 2 ground-floor windows lit from within with the dim amber of lamps on timers. It was not a welcoming light. It was the light of a house that had been waiting a long time and had stopped trying to look like it cared. Nadia cut the engine. In the sudden quiet, the sea became louder. She sat for a moment longer than necessary. 6 weeks since the funeral. 6 weeks of sorting through her mother's flat in Bristol, fielding calls from the estate agent, signing documents, making sensible decisions with the dry efficiency of a woman who had learned early that grief was most manageable when given a task to focus on. This was the last task. Come to Ironcliff. Collect Lenora's remaining belongings. Close the estate. She got out of the car. The wind came off the water and hit her full in the face. Salt, low tide, something underneath it she had no name for. Something that made her think, involuntarily and absurdly, of pine resin warmed by sun. She stood still for a second, breathing it in, and that was when she saw it. On the cliff above the house. Perhaps 200 meters away, where the land ended and the sea began. A silhouette. Massive. 4-legged. Perfectly, unnervingly still. It was facing her. Nadia looked at it. It did not move. The wind moved around it and it stood like something that had grown there, like the gorse, like the stone wall at the cliff's edge. It watched her with an attention she could feel at this distance, in the dark, across 200 meters of wet grass. She picked up her bag. She walked to the front door. She used the key the estate agent had posted to her 3 weeks ago, and she let herself in, and she closed the door behind her without looking back. She told herself it was a dog. On the cliff, the silhouette did not move until dawn. Chapter 1. What she left behind. The studio was at the back of the house, north-facing, its single large window looking out over the sea path and the cliff beyond. Lenora had chosen it deliberately, Nadia could see that immediately. Her mother had always painted in north light, claimed it was the only honest light, the only light that didn't flatter or distort. What you saw in north light was what was actually there. 3 days into her stay and Nadia had not yet been able to open the studio door for longer than a few seconds. She stood outside it now, her hand on the frame, and did what she always did, she catalogued. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine coming through the gap. The edge of a canvas visible, large, perhaps 4 feet across, turned face to the wall. A pair of work boots by the skirting board, still holding the shape of her mother's feet. She catalogued all of it, stored it somewhere carefully, and moved on. The rest of the estate she had managed with the methodical patience her colleagues at the archive described as her professional superpower and her ex-boyfriend had once described, less generously, as emotional avoidance. She catalogued, she sorted, she packed. She found the detritus of 3 years. The last 3 years of her mother's life, the years Lenora had spent at Ironcliff without once inviting Nadia to visit, without explaining why she'd come here in the first place or why she'd stayed. Nadia had stopped asking, eventually. That had been their arrangement, unspoken and long-standing. Lenora went where she needed to go, and Nadia did not demand explanations, and in return Lenora sent postcards and occasional long phone calls and showed up for Christmas with expensive wine and paintings she'd done of places she wouldn't describe. It had worked, after a fashion. It had been a relationship conducted at a careful distance, and Nadia had convinced herself the distance was mutual, that they both preferred it, that it was simply the way they were built. She understood now, standing in the corridor of her mother's last home, that she had been wrong about that. The distance had not been mutual. It had been imposed. Lenora had kept Nadia at arm's length not because she didn't want her close but because she was hiding something. This place. Whatever had brought her here. Whatever had kept her. Nadia went to make tea. She found the journals on the fourth day. She had been working through the writing desk in the sitting room. A heavy Victorian piece, mahogany, entirely out of keeping with everything else in the house, which ran to worn coastal furnishings and practical things. The desk had a locked lower drawer whose small brass keyhole she'd assumed was simply stuck. She'd been planning to force it. Then she'd taken down a painting from the wall above the fireplace, a small oil, storm clouds over water, nothing she'd seen her mother work on. To pack it, and found a key taped to the back of the frame with a strip of brown packing tape so old it had gone brittle. Her mother had hidden a key behind a painting. Lenora, who had once told Nadia that privacy was a person's most essential possession and should never require explanation. The drawer held 4 journals. Nadia sat down on the floor with the first one and read until the light changed. Lenora's handwriting was nothing like her usual hand. Her mother's normal writing was architectural, precise, the letters formed as if she were still the art student she'd been 40 years ago and good presentation was still being marked. This was cramped and fast, the pen pressing hard enough to corrugate the pages below. This was someone writing urgently, writing to outpace something. The first entry was dated almost exactly 3 years ago, within a week of Lenora's arrival at Ironcliff. The coast road is worse than the agency said. Arrived after dark. The estate is Gothic in the way that only genuinely old buildings can be Gothic, not performing it, simply unable to help it. The gate was open. Odd. Nadia went still. She read on. For entries later, written in the cramped urgent hand rather than the careful one, as if Lenora had switched modes mid-stay without noticing. There is something on the cliff. I see it at night. I tell myself it is a dog. Nadia put the journal down on the floor in front of her and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she picked it up again and kept reading, because she was a forensic archivist and this was what she did. She gathered evidence, she assembled a picture, she did not stop before the picture was complete regardless of what it showed. She read, I should leave. I know I should leave. 3 times across 2 entries, like a mantra that kept failing to convince. And then, I can't make myself leave. I've been trying to identify why for 2 weeks and I cannot. It isn't the work, though the work is the best I've done in a decade. It isn't the coast, though the coast is extraordinary. It is something else. Something I don't have a word for yet. She stopped at the end of the first journal, Lenora's first 2 months at Ironcliff, and sat in the settling dark of the sitting room without moving for quite some time. Outside, the sea carried on its rhythmic indifference. The wind moved through the gorse. The house settled around her, old stone accommodating old cold, the particular creaking language of buildings that have stood through many winters and expect to stand through many more. Nadia realized, with a start that surprised her, that she was not afraid. She was something else entirely. Something she also didn't have a word for yet. She went out to the sea path that night. She would not have been able to explain this decision satisfactorily to anyone who asked. She had read her mother's warning, appearing later, near the end of the first journal, in block capitals and underlined twice, do not go to the SEA path after dark, and she had registered it as information rather than instruction, which was perhaps a character flaw. She was 32 years old and had been making her own decisions about where to walk since she was 8, and she did not, when she examined her reasoning in the moment, feel afraid. She felt, instead, that if something was going to watch her from that cliff, she would rather meet it on her own terms than lie in a bed she couldn't sleep in and stare at the ceiling. The sea path ran from the side gate of the estate's garden down the cliff's gentle shoulder toward a small protected beach below. She had a torch. She went perhaps a third of the way down before she stopped, because she had seen it. It was above her, on the clifftop grass, and it was closer than it had been the first night. Perhaps 20 feet. She could see it clearly in the ambient light of the cloud-smeared moon and the torch beam she had not yet switched on, enormous, black-furred, built on a scale that bore no resemblance to any domestic animal. Its head was level with its shoulders. Its shoulders reached her height. It was sitting, not threatening, not crouched, simply present in the way boulders were present, as if it had always been here and the grass had grown up around it. She had spent 4 years working with evidence. She was trained to observe without overlaying interpretation. What she observed was this: the animal's eyes were gray. Gray with something amber in the center, like a flame seen through sea glass. And it was looking at her with an attention entirely unlike any animal's attention she had known: dogs, the occasional stable horse, her neighbor's indifferent cats. Those attentions were interested, distracted, reflexive. This was focused. Deliberate. It was looking at her the way a person looks at someone they have been waiting for. She did not run. She stood very still and it sat very still, and between them the sea wind moved, carrying salt and low tide and that other smell she had caught on the first night. Pine resin and something deeper, cold stone warmed slowly from within. She breathed it in, and her whole chest loosened for the first time in 6 weeks. Something that had been contracted since the morning she got the call about her mother released, momentarily and inexplicably, like a knot worked loose by a patient hand. Then the wolf turned. It moved into the gorse in 3 unhurried strides and was gone, as completely as if it had stepped through a door into somewhere else. Nadia stood on the dark sea path for another few minutes. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, not fearful, just present in the way it rarely was these days. She was aware of the cold, the salt taste at the back of her throat, the torch in her hand that she hadn't yet switched on. She was aware that she felt, for the first time since her mother died, genuinely, fully awake. She went back inside. She opened the journal to the next entry. Her mother had written, in that cramped and urgent hand, "It has eyes the color of winter. And it looks at me as if it knows everything I haven't told anyone." Below that, 1 line, underlined twice: "Do not go to the SEA path after dark." Nadia read the line. She turned the page. She kept reading. Above the house, on the clifftop where the grass ended and the dark sky began, the wolf settled back into its watching. It would still be there at dawn. It always was. Chapter 2. The caretaker. The estate agent had mentioned a caretaker in passing, in the same breath as the boiler settings and the location of the fuse box, as if he were another piece of domestic infrastructure. Off-site, mostly, she'd said. Handles the grounds and the maintenance. Nadia had assumed this meant she would not see him. She was wrong. On the 5th morning, she was in the kitchen when movement through the window caught her attention. A figure coming up from the direction of the old boathouse, a low stone structure at the far edge of the property, nearly hidden by the coastal willows that grew between it and the main house. Tall, dark-haired, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who knew the terrain well enough not to have to think about it. He stopped at the kitchen garden wall and looked up at the house. He seemed, from this distance, to be recalibrating something. Nadia filled the kettle. By the time she heard the knock at the back door she had prepared what she needed to say. She was Lenora Voss's daughter. She would be here for 2 or possibly 3 weeks. She had no concerns about the maintenance arrangements and would not need assistance beyond what was already contracted. A clean, brief introduction. She was good at those. She opened the door. The man standing in the doorway was perhaps mid-30s, dressed for outdoor work in worn canvas trousers and a heavy gray wool jumper. He was lean in the way people who work physically are lean, not built for appearance, built for use. His hands, she noticed, were not quite still. Not nervous, something more contained than nervousness, like the stillness of water that looks calm because the current beneath it is so strong it doesn't ripple. His eyes were gray with amber at the centers. Nadia felt the floor tilt, very slightly, beneath her. He said, "I'm Cael Morrow, the caretaker. I was told the estate would be unoccupied for the foreseeable future." His voice was low and unhurried and carried faint traces of an Irish West Coast accent, the kind that surfaces in certain vowels and then disappears again. "I should have introduced myself sooner. I apologize for that. Nadia Voss." Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. "Lenora's daughter. I'm here to settle her affairs." He nodded. Something moved briefly across his face, not quite recognition, not quite surprise. More like the look of a man who has heard a name he expected to hear and is deciding how to respond to having expected it. "I was sorry to hear about your mother," he said. She was good company, when she wanted to be." "She rarely wanted to be," Nadia said, and heard the bitterness in it and wished she hadn't. Cael Morrow looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "No. But when she did, it was worth waiting for." He excused himself with minimal ceremony. The conversation lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Nadia stood at the closed back door for a moment after he left, then turned around, walked to the kitchen table, sat down, and placed both palms flat on the wood surface and breathed. She told herself she was being absurd. She had barely slept in 6 weeks and she was grieving and she was alone in a strange house and she had seen a large animal in the dark and any reasonable person might develop strange associations under those circumstances. Gray eyes were gray eyes. There was no reason on earth why looking into a caretaker's face should feel like the final piece of something clicking into place. She made her tea. She went back to work. She caught herself at the window twice before noon. That evening she found a passage in the second journal, dated 14 months into her mother's stay. "He doesn't seem to remember me from one day to the next. We speak, properly speak, about the work, about the coast, about books he's read. He is intelligent and very private and occasionally, just occasionally, there is something behind his eyes that is entirely unlike the rest of him. Something older. Then it's gone, and he is simply the caretaker again, courteous and distant, and I begin to think I imagined it. But the animal remembers. The animal always recognizes me immediately. It never forgets. I am starting to understand that they are not entirely the same thing." Nadia read the entry 3 times. She held it up against the gray-eyed man she'd met this morning and she held it up against the wolf on the cliff and she tried to find the place where those two things did not connect. She could not find it. She was a forensic archivist. Evidence was her native language. She knew how to assemble a picture from fragments even when the fragments were strange, even when the picture they assembled was one she had no framework for. She had reconstructed the last hours of historical figures from handwriting samples and shipping manifests and the water-stained pages of letters written in languages she'd had to learn. She could handle this. She opened the next journal. She read until 2 in the morning. The wolf came again that night, though she didn't go out to the sea path. She woke at some point well past midnight to the sound of something moving on the path below her window, a deliberate, unhurried sound, not furtive, not threatening, simply present. She lay very still and listened. After a moment it stopped. She got up and went to the window. It was below on the gravel path that ran between the garden wall and the cliff edge. Sitting, as before. Not looking up at the window, or not obviously, its great dark head was turned toward the sea, and there was something in the stillness of its posture that reminded her, painfully and precisely, of the way people sat at funerals. Not grief, exactly. Something that had moved past grief into a territory without a name. She watched it for perhaps 10 minutes before it rose and walked, without urgency, back toward the cliff and disappeared over the edge into the darkness of the path below. In the morning, on the gravel directly beneath her window, there was a line of 7 smooth stones. They had not been there the night before. They were sea-smoothed and dark-wet, the kind of stone found only at the base of the cliff path where the tide came in, and they were arranged with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental in it. Nadia crouched and looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then she went inside, sat down at the writing desk, opened the 3rd journal, and began to read. He found her in the kitchen garden that afternoon. She was cataloging her mother's plants. Most had gone wild over the 6 weeks since Lenora's death, some beyond recovery, a few stubbornly thriving, and she looked up to find Cael Morrow standing at the garden gate watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately identify. "The stones," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. "Under my window." "Was that you?" Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, it was more complex than guilt, and quieter. "No," he said. "Then what was it?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garden wall rather than at her, which she was beginning to recognize as his way of being honest about something he didn't want to say. "Something that doesn't know how else to express itself," he said finally. Nadia straightened up. She looked at him directly. In the afternoon light his eyes were more amber than gray, and she thought, not for the first time, that the proportions of those two colors seemed to shift depending on something she couldn't identify. Time of day. Weather. The distance between them. "Cael," she said. She had not used his name before. She felt him register it. Was there ever a woman here named Rourke? The silence that followed was long enough to tell her everything she needed to know about whether she was asking the right question. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was very careful. "My mother's journals." This was not entirely true. Lenora had not used that name. Nadia had found it herself, in the local newspaper archive she'd accessed on her laptop the night before, a small item, 8 years old, about a woman reported missing after a winter storm. A guest at Ironcliff estate. The body never found. She wrote about a woman who left suddenly. I looked into it. He turned and looked at her then, fully, and for a moment the careful control of his expression failed. What was underneath it was not simple. It was not something she had a word for either. "You should go inside," he said quietly. "I'll finish the path." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He picked up the wheelbarrow he'd set down at the gate and went to work on the far end of the path without looking at her again. Nadia watched him for a moment, then went back to the plants. Above them both, the sky had turned the color of old pewter and the sea wind had sharpened. She could smell the cold front coming in off the Atlantic, and beneath it, as always now, that other scent. Pine resin and cold stone. Warm and dangerous in equal measure. She did not go inside. The wolf. The wolf did not experience time the way the man did. Time, for the wolf, was a sequence of scents rather than a sequence of events. The salt cycle of tides. The slow decay of the gorse, season to season. The intervals between presences, the estate empty, then occupied, then empty again, measured not in weeks but in the accumulation of smells that said inhabited and then, after a while, said not. But this scent. This one it had been waiting for across years of absence. When it had come through the gates in the dark, her car, her exhaust, and underneath both of those the blood signature, it knew the way the wolf knew its own territory. Something had snapped taut inside the animal. A wire pulled suddenly to its limit. It had gone to the cliff and it had sat and it had simply breathed her in from 200 meters, cataloging. Salt air. Old paper. Something beneath those. Something older, something of the same frequency as the wolf itself, muted and strange, like a voice heard through walls. She had not run. Others had run. The woman 8 years ago, the wolf remembered the wrongness of that encounter even now, the way the bond had misfired, casting itself towards someone it could not hold. Rourke had not been frightened of the wolf itself, at first. She had been frightened of the wanting of it, of the way she could feel the animal's need pressing against her from the outside without any answering frequency inside her. Like being followed by a gravity that had no claim on you. She had run into the sea on the 4th night, and the wolf had let her go because it had understood, in its wordless way, that to pursue was to destroy. It had not gone near the estate after that. 4 years. The man had been grateful. The wolf had been waiting. This one was different. She had not run. She had stood on the sea path in the dark with her torch unlit and looked at the wolf with the particular attention of someone assembling evidence, and the wolf had felt, not felt, known, with the certainty of a thing written in the blood rather than learned in the mind, that there was an answering frequency. Faint. Muted. But there. It had taken everything. The wolf had to turn away and walk into the gorse. Now it paced the cliff edge in the small hours, kept from the house by the man's dwindling control, and waited. It had left the stones as an offering, the best stones from the deep tide line, arranged as carefully as the wolf could manage. An act of provision. I know this place. I know what it holds. I can bring you what the deep water keeps. The man, when he woke and found mud on his hands and knees and no memory of the hours past midnight, pressed his forehead against the cold wall of the boathouse and breathed until the shaking stopped. The wolf watched from the cliff edge, patient and certain and entirely without mercy, as it always was when it wanted something. It wanted to be known. That was all it had ever wanted. To be looked at, by the right person, and not have them look away. Chapter 3. What my mother knew. Cael Morrow drove up on a Thursday in a mud-spattered Land Rover and parked it at an angle in the estate's drive that suggested she had never once worried about blocking anyone in. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired like her brother, with the kind of open face that made directness look like kindness rather than aggression. She introduced herself as a coastal veterinarian from the town below, said she came up every few weeks to check on Cael, and would Nadia mind if she made herself a coffee. She already had the kettle on before Nadia answered. They sat at the kitchen table while Dara drank her coffee and asked careful questions. How long was Nadia staying? Had she been sleeping? Had she been eating properly? She asked this the way a medical professional asks it, without judgment but without softness either. Was she finding everything she needed in the estate? Then, after a pause, have you been going to the sea path at night? Nadia looked at her. Why would you ask that specifically? Dara wrapped both hands around her mug. She didn't look away. Because my brother asked me to come up this week, she said. He didn't say why in so many words. He didn't have to. He asked you to come because of me. He asked me to come, Dara said carefully, because of what's happening to him because of you. Which is different, and which I think you probably deserve to understand. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the sea made its relentless argument against the cliff. In the hall, the old house clock marked the half-hour. Tell me, Nadia said. Dara told her the way a veterinarian would tell it. As observed biology, as a system with rules, as something that could be explained if you were willing to set aside the categories you'd been using until now. She was not dramatic about it. She did not apologize for the strangeness of what she was saying. She spoke the way people speak when they have had to explain a difficult truth many times and have learned that simplicity is kinder than cushioning. Their family were shifters. Had been for as many generations as the family's memory stretched. The wolf was not separate from the man, it was not a possession or a disease or an affliction. It was an aspect, the way temperament was an aspect, except that this one had teeth and 4 legs and a territorial instinct that ran deeper than reason. The bond was the harder thing to explain. Wolves, Dara said, pair for life. That's not metaphor. The biological mechanism of it is real and it's involuntary, and it has nothing to do with whether the person involved consents to it or even knows about it. The wolf identifies a mate through scent, through blood chemistry, through something we don't fully understand. Once it's identified, the bond begins to form whether the man wants it to or not. And Cael doesn't want it to. Cael, Dara said, with a precision that told Nadia this was a distinction that mattered enormously to her, is terrified of it. Which is not the same thing. Nadia absorbed this. She thought of the careful stillness of him. The way he had not quite met her eyes on some occasions and had looked at her too directly on others, as if he were calibrating the distance between them and finding no safe setting. The bond, she said. It's tied to my bloodline. My mother triggered it. Dara's expression shifted, something like relief, that Nadia had arrived at this herself. 20-odd years ago. She was the estate's artist-in-residence. The bond activated. She left before Cael's predecessor, his father, could act on it. The bond went dormant when she left the territory. She paused. Until you came through the gates. And it transferred. It was waiting, Dara corrected. It was always waiting for the bloodline to return. You happened to be the bloodline that returned. Nadia looked at her hands on the table. She thought of the stones arranged on the gravel below her window. She thought of the loosening in her chest on the sea path. She thought of her mother writing "I can't make myself leave" across 3 different entries and her mother's final line, written in the last journal, the one Nadia had reached only last night. "I think I left something of myself here that I never retrieved." There was a woman, Nadia said. Rourke. 8 years ago. The change in Dara was immediate and total. Her stillness became a different kind of stillness. Who told you about Rourke? The newspaper archive. Nadia met her eyes. What actually happened? Dara set her mug down with great care. The bond misfired, she said quietly. She wasn't the right bloodline. The wolf began to circle her anyway, it can't always distinguish. She felt it. She felt the wanting of it from the outside with nothing inside her to answer it, and it frightened her in a very particular way. Like being chosen by something that has no business choosing you. A pause. She ran into the sea. We don't know if she survived. The body was never found. And Cael, Dara said, has been medicating himself for 8 years to keep the wolf at a level where it can't act on what it wants. The sedatives dull the bond. They also dull everything else. She looked at Nadia steadily. He has been managing. Until 3 weeks ago, he was managing very well. Nadia understood what she was being told. She was not the danger to herself. She was the danger to Cael, or rather, she was the thing that was making Cael dangerous to himself. The dosages that had been sufficient were no longer sufficient. The bond activated by her presence was outpacing the medication designed to suppress it. What does claiming mean? Nadia said. In practical terms. Dara looked at her for a long moment. A bite. At the throat, where the pulse is strongest. For a wolf paired with another shifter, it settles the bond permanently, both parties. For a human, she paused, it depends entirely on whether the human has the capacity to hold the bond. Rourke didn't. The transformation began and her body had no framework for it. And if I have the capacity, then it settles. You'd carry something of the bond permanently. Not as a burden, not as a transformation, but as a kind of permanent attunement. You'd know where he was. You'd feel his distress. You would be, in the wolf's understanding, his. A beat. And he would be yours. Completely. That part is not negotiable. Nadia was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sea continued. The wind pushed at the kitchen window. Somewhere in the direction of the boathouse there was a sound she had learned to identify over the past days. Something heavy and deliberate, like a large body settling its weight. If I leave, Nadia said, what happens to him? Dara's face told her the answer before her voice did. He goes back to managing, she said. He's done it before. He'll do it again. A pause. He will manage. He will be fine. He will be entirely fine. Her voice was entirely steady. And it will cost him something he'll never entirely get back. She did not say, it's already costing him. She didn't have to. Nadia stood up from the table. She went to the window and stood looking out at the garden, at the cliff beyond, at the line where the gray sky met the darker gray of the sea. Does he know you're telling me this? No, Dara said. He'd consider it a betrayal of your autonomy. He'd say you have the right to leave without knowing what it costs him, because the cost is his to carry and not yours to weigh. He sounds exhausting, Nadia said. Despite everything, Dara laughed. A short, surprised sound. He absolutely is, she said. He always has been. Nadia walked the sea path that evening alone, without a torch, knowing the route well enough now not to need one. The sky had cleared after the afternoon's overcast and the stars were extraordinary, the way they only were this far from any city, brilliant and close and indifferent. She thought about her mother leaving. About 30 entries of I should leave and then departure, sudden and final, and the line written years later in the last journal that Nadia had once read as regret about an artistic period left unfinished and now understood to be something much larger and more permanent. She thought about what it meant that her mother had carried whatever she'd left behind in this place for 20 years without ever returning for it, and without ever telling Nadia it existed. She thought about Cael Morrow pressing his forehead against the cold wall of the boathouse in the small hours with mud on his hands and no memory of how it got there. She sat on the cliff edge for a long time, arms around her knees, looking at the black Atlantic. Below her, somewhere on the path, she heard the wolf settle into the grass. It had not come up to the clifftop where she was. It was simply present, below and to her left, and the sound of it settling. That low exhale, that particular weight finding the earth, was, inexplicably, the least alone she had felt in 6 weeks. She did not look down. She did not need to. I know you're there, she said aloud, to the dark and the sea and the thing below her in the grass. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But I know you're there. From below, very quietly, something that was not quite a sound, more a shift in the air, a change in the quality of the silence around her, suggested it had heard. Chapter 4. The Cliff Edge. She found him at the boathouse door at dusk, the way she had known, for the past 2 days, that she eventually would. She had spent those 2 days rereading every journal from the beginning. Not as grief this time, not as the task of a dutiful daughter assembling the pieces of a person she hadn't known well enough. As evidence. She had read her mother's account of the bond the way she read historical documents. For what was stated and for what was omitted, for what the writer understood at the time of writing and for what she understood only in retrospect. What she had found in the gap between those 2 things was significant. Lenora had been frightened by the wolf. That was clear from the first dozen entries. But the fear had changed its character over time, in ways her mother had not entirely acknowledged to herself. What had begun as the fear of a predator had become, somewhere in the second journal, the fear of wanting something she had no framework for wanting. The fear of a pull she couldn't account for and couldn't refuse. She had left not because she was afraid the wolf would harm her but because she was afraid she would let it. Her mother had run from desire dressed as danger. Nadia had spent 32 years watching the women in her family make that particular mistake and she was not going to make it herself. She knocked on the boathouse door at dusk. Cael answered the door in work clothes, hands clean, an expression of careful neutrality that she recognized as something he put on the way other people put on a coat. Something to wear in the presence of a situation he wasn't sure he could handle. "Rourke," she said. Not a question. He stepped back from the door without a word and let her in. The boathouse was not what she'd expected. It was a working space, tools along one wall, a workbench along the other, a collection of marine equipment in various states of repair, but it was also, clearly and unmistakably, the space where someone had been living very carefully and very alone for a long time. The tidiness of it had a quality beyond cleanliness. It was the tidiness of a person who controlled their environment because there were other things they could not control. There was a cot along the back wall. There was a locked cabinet beside the workbench that she understood, without being told, held the sedatives. Cael stood near the workbench with his arms crossed and his eyes tracking something just to the left of her face, the careful gaze of a man who has learned that looking directly at certain things makes them harder to manage. She wasn't the right bloodline, he said. He had apparently decided that the conversation had already started and there was no point establishing a perimeter around it. The bond misfired. I didn't realize what was happening until she was already frightened and then I tried to put distance between us, to give her time, but the wolf, a pause, short and controlled, the wolf doesn't always wait for me to catch up with it. She ran. I should have been able to stop that. I wasn't. You've been medicating yourself since then. Yes. And it's not working now. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no. Nadia looked at the cot against the back wall. At the locked cabinet. At the man who had been sleeping in a boathouse and locking up his own medication because he did not entirely trust himself and was honest enough to acknowledge it. Do you know, she said, who I am to you? The quality of his stillness changed. It was not the controlled stillness she had come to recognize. It was something that came after control, the stillness on the other side of it. Yes, he said. Does it frighten you? A long pause. The sea, outside, in the pause. The last of the dusk light coming through the boathouse's high small windows and catching the amber in his eyes and making it glow. More than anything I have ever been, he said. His voice was perfectly flat and perfectly honest. You should know that. You should know that I am not in a position to be. I cannot give you a person who is whole, who has all his pieces in the right places. What I can give you is a wolf that would lie down in front of a moving vehicle before it let anything harm you. Those are not the same thing, and I am aware of that. I am very aware of that. I'm not asking for a whole person, Nadia said. I'm 32 years old and I was raised by a woman who kept secrets for 20 years and had a relationship with her own daughter that was mostly conducted through postcards and careful silences. I don't have a model for whole people. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, something that had the shape of a smile without the ease of one. That's not a reason to accept less than you deserve. I'm not accepting anything yet, she said. I'm asking a question. What question? She looked at him directly. She had spent her career looking at evidence and drawing conclusions from it, and she had learned, over time, to trust her own reading of what was actually there. What was actually there, in this moment, in the dimming boathouse, with the sea coming through the walls and the amber light in his eyes and the locked cabinet standing witness between them, was a man who was frightened of himself on behalf of someone else. Who had been frightened of himself on someone else's behalf for 8 years. The wolf leaves me offerings, she said. Stones from the deep tide line. A seal washed up on the beach last week that the housekeeper thought had stranded, but I read the tide tables and it hadn't. It was placed. She paused. What is it trying to say? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I can provide. That's what it's saying. I know this place. I can bring you what it holds. His voice was low and careful and entirely undefended. It doesn't have better language than that. It's working with very old words. And you? What are you trying to say? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the workbench, at his hands, at the middle distance of the space between them. Then he said, that I have been alone in this building for a very long time and I am acutely aware of how much of that has been my own choice and how much has been. I've been trying to protect people from something I carry. That seemed like the right approach. I'm no longer entirely certain it was. Nadia said nothing. She waited. I remember you, Cael said. From every conversation we've had. The man does. He doesn't forget. A pause, and something in his voice that was not quite loss and not quite longing but lived in the territory between them. I just couldn't, I couldn't let myself trust it. That was real and not just the bond making things seem like what I wanted them to be. Is that what happened with Rourke? Rourke, he said carefully, was a good person who had nothing to do with any of this and was frightened by something that had no right to involve her. That was not, what is happening now is not that. I know the difference. The wolf knows the difference. That's the thing about the bloodline bond. It doesn't misfire twice. She went to the sea path that night. She had not intended to, or she had intended not to, which was not quite the same thing. She simply found herself there after dark with the stars above and the Atlantic below, sitting in the clifftop grass the way she had sat every night this week, and this time she heard the wolf before she saw it. Not footsteps. A change in the air. The scent arriving ahead of the animal itself, pine resin, cold stone, the deep-tied smell of the offered stones. And then the soft displacement of grass as it came through the gorse and settled, perhaps 8 feet away to her left. She did not look at it immediately. She looked at the sea. It waited. After a few minutes she turned her head. The wolf was lying in the grass with its great dark head on its forepaws, watching her with those gray-amber eyes. Not the hungry, coiled watchfulness of the first nights. Something different. Something that had come to the other side of patience and was now simply, quietly present. "I read all of them," she said. "All 4 journals." She paused. She loved it here. She loved it and she was afraid of loving it, and she left because she was afraid of what staying would mean. And then she spent 20 years, writing postcards to me from places she was never quite happy in because she had left the place she was actually happy in, because it frightened her. The wolf's ears moved. It lifted its head slightly. "I don't want to do that," Nadia said. "I don't want to be the kind of person who leaves the thing they actually want because it doesn't fit the shape of what they thought they were allowed to have. I watched someone spend a lifetime doing that and it," she stopped. "Breathed. It made her very lonely. Even when she was with me. Even at Christmas with the expensive wine." She reached out. The wolf did not move as her hand found the thick fur at the side of its neck, did not pull away, did not press forward, simply remained absolutely still while she felt the warmth of it, the solidity, the slow massive rhythm of its breathing beneath her palm. "I know it's you," she said. She had said this before. She meant it differently now. "I mean, I know what it means that it's you. I've read enough to understand what I'd be choosing. I know it isn't simple and I know it won't be easy and I know your sister is going to have opinions about the timeline." A sound came from the wolf then, low, reverberant, not a growl. Something that lived in the register below growls, below speech, below words. Something that went directly through the bones without stopping at the mind. "I'm not saying yes," Nadia said. "Not tonight. Tonight I'm saying I'm not leaving. That I'm going to stay and I'm going to figure out what this is and what it costs and what it gives, and I'm going to do that with my eyes open. That's all. That's what I have tonight." The wolf pressed its head into her palm. Behind them, from the direction of the boathouse, she heard it, a sound like wood under pressure, like a grip applied to something it couldn't help but break. Not violence, the opposite of violence. The sound of restraint so complete it had become its own kind of force. The amber in the wolf's eyes, in the starlight, looked exactly like a flame seen through sea glass. She stayed until the cold drove her in. The wolf stayed until dawn. Chapter 5. The Salt and the Sorrow. He came to the house before sunrise. Nadia heard the knock at the back door and was already awake, had been awake, lying in the dark of Lenore's guest room, listening to the wind come off the water and thinking about the shape of choices. Not whether to make them. She had moved past that somewhere on the sea path the night before. She was thinking about what they meant, choices made with full knowledge, choices that could not be unmade. Not whether those were the best kind or the worst kind, but whether there was actually a difference. She went downstairs in her socks. Cael was standing at the back door in the same clothes she'd last seen him in, which told her he hadn't slept. He looked, as he always looked in his unguarded moments, like a man holding himself together by some method he hadn't explained to anyone. His eyes were more gray than amber in the pre-dawn light. He looked exhausted and entirely awake. "I made tea," she said, which was not true, she hadn't put the kettle on yet, but which committed her to a direction and she found that useful. He came inside. She put the kettle on. He sat at the table and looked at his hands, and she made tea with her back to him because she thought he might find it easier to speak if she wasn't watching him, and she was right. "My father," he said, when she set the mugs down and sat across from him, "was the most decent man I have ever known." Methodical and careful and entirely without cruelty. He loved my mother with a completeness that, I've never seen anything like it. He would have done anything for her. A pause. He killed her. Nadia kept her hands around her mug and did not speak. Not directly. Not intentionally. The bond, over years, it takes something from the human partner. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But she tired, eventually, in a way that doctors couldn't explain and she couldn't articulate, and she died young and my father understood why and it broke something in him that could not be repaired. He looked up. I held him while he died. I was 24. He asked me to make it quick. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the first birds were starting, tentative, a few notes, testing the approaching light. He became alpha by killing his father, Cael said. I became alpha by killing mine. There is a pattern in this family that I have spent a long time trying to understand and a longer time trying not to continue. And the sedatives were a way of giving the wolf nothing to work with. If I didn't allow the bond to form, I couldn't be responsible for what it cost someone. He turned the mug in his hands. It worked, after a fashion. It cost me other things. I stopped. I found it very difficult to be present, after a while. In conversations, in the world. The wolf provides it provides something I don't have a word for. A frequency. When it's dampened, everything becomes somewhat distant. Manageable, but distant. Like being behind glass, Nadia said. He looked at her sharply. That's how I've felt since my mother died, she said. Not just since she died. 4 years, maybe. Managing the distance instead of closing it. A long moment. The kettle had gone cold. Neither of them moved. What I want to ask you, Cael said slowly, as if choosing each word before he allowed it, is something I have no right to ask. I know that. I want to be clear that I know that. The bond is involuntary on my side. It is not in any way involuntary on yours. You can leave this morning and go back to your life and I will be fine. Dara will tell you the same. I know what Dara will tell me, Nadia said. We had a fairly comprehensive conversation. Something that was almost amusement moved across his face, briefly. Of course you did. She said you'd consider it a betrayal of my autonomy. I do. She said you'd say the cost is yours to carry and not mine to weigh. It is. Nadia looked at him across the table. In the grey pre-dawn light he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had organized his entire life around the carrying of it, because the alternative was setting it down and finding out what it had been resting on. Here's what I've understood from 4 journals and 6 days of evidence, she said. Her voice was even, she had assembled the picture and this was how she delivered pictures when they were complete. My mother came here and something happened that she didn't have a framework for. The bond found her and she felt it from the inside and it frightened her, not because it was bad but because it was large. Larger than what she thought she was allowed to want. And she left, and she was fine, she managed, she was absolutely fine, and she was also deeply, quietly, permanently unhappy in a way she never explained to me and I never understood until I came here and started reading her handwriting. He was very still. I don't want to be the woman in those journals, Nadia said. I watched what managing looked like. I watched it for 32 years and I am not interested in it. A pause. That's not the same as being reckless. I'm not saying yes to something I don't understand. I understand the cost. I understand what carrying the bond means, what it takes from the human partner over time, what happened to your mother. I understand all of that. And I'm asking what it gives, she said. You told me the wolf was trying to say, I can provide. I know this place. That's what the stones meant, and the seal. What does the man want to say? Not what it costs. Not what I should know before I decide. What does it actually give? The pause was long enough that she heard the birds outside go from tentative to certain. Long enough for the light to change from gray to the first pale blue of approaching dawn. Then Cael said, "Someone who can see all of it. The man and the wolf and the parts that aren't one or the other. Someone who doesn't require me to only be the version of myself that fits in rooms." His voice was very quiet. I have managed this place and this life and this thing I carry, and I have done it alone because it seemed like the only responsible option, and I have been very alone." A pause, and then, as if it cost him, "It gives you that. It gives you someone who will know where you are, always. Someone the wolf will never let come to harm. It gives you the particular attention of a creature that does not divide its attention between things." Another pause. "I don't know if that's enough. I don't know that it should be." "It's not nothing," Nadia said. "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." She reached across the table. It was not a dramatic gesture. She simply moved her hand across the worn wood of the kitchen table until it rested over his, not gripping, just there, present, the warmth of her palm over the back of his hand that had been holding the mug with a steadiness that had, she now understood, been costing him something. Cael went absolutely still. Not the wolf's stillness, which she had learned to read as containment, as the coiled and deliberate quiet of a predator regulating itself. This was different. This was the stillness that came after containment. The stillness on the other side of it, when the thing being held has been met rather than suppressed. His hand turned under hers, very slowly, and held it. Neither of them said anything. The dawn came in through the kitchen windows and the birds went on and the sea went on and the old house settled its old stones around them, and for a long time there was nothing required of either of them beyond the simple fact of being in the same room, in the same light, with nothing between them that hadn't been said. After a while Nadia said, "The last entry in the 4th journal. The one she wrote the day before she left. Do you want to know what it says?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. She had memorized it. She had not meant to memorize it, she had simply read it enough times that it had made itself permanent, the way things did when they were the last thing a person said before a door closed. She wrote, "If I were braver, or perhaps just more broken, I think I might have stayed." Cael closed his eyes briefly. "She was neither," Nadia said. "She was careful. She protected herself very well." A pause. "I'm broken enough. And I'm going to choose to be brave enough. That's all. That's the whole decision." His grip on her hand tightened, very slightly. Not desperate, not the grip of someone afraid she was going to leave. The grip of someone who has been handed something and is choosing to hold it carefully. "I remember," he said. His voice was rough in a way it hadn't been before. "Every conversation. Every morning you've been here. The way you look at the cliff like you're reading something it's trying to tell you. The way you came through the gates and stood in the wind before you came inside, like you needed a moment to decide whether the house deserved you." He stopped. Started again. "The man remembers all of it. He wants you to know that." Nadia thought about the glass wall she'd been living behind for 6 weeks, for years maybe, and she thought about the sea path at night and the loosening in her chest, and she thought about her mother's handwriting on the page of a journal written in a room upstairs. She thought about 32 years of careful distance. "I know," she said. She found the last entry later that morning. Not in the journals, she had read all 4 through to the final page. This was a loose sheet, folded in half and tucked behind the canvas in the studio that Nadia had finally opened. The painting that had been turned to the wall was of the cliff path, rendered in the north light of Lenora's studio, the gore silver gold and the sea beyond it in about 40 shades of gray. It was the best thing her mother had painted in the last decade of her life. The note was not addressed to Nadia. It was not addressed to anyone. It was simply written, in the careful architectural hand rather than the urgent one, as if Lenora had had time, finally, to slow down. "I hope whoever finds this knows something I didn't. I hope they're less afraid of the large things than I was. I hope they understand that the grief and the wanting and the being chosen are all the same country, just different weathers. I hope they stay. Nadia folded the note and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She went to find Cael. Outside, on the cliff, the wolf raised its head from the grass and looked toward the house. Its amber eyes caught the mid-morning light and held it. It did not pace. It did not prowl. It simply sat in the sea wind, looking at the door she had just come through, and waited with the particular patience of a creature that has finally understood the difference between waiting and being kept. The door opened. She came out into the light. Epilogue. 1 year later. On winter mornings she walked the sea path before work, while the light was still the pale violet of not quite dawn and the Atlantic was a flat pewter disk beneath the clouds. The wolf walked beside her. Not behind, not ahead, beside, its great dark shoulder at the level of her hand, its pace adjusting to hers without effort or instruction, the way two people walk together after they have walked together long enough that the adjustment has become automatic. The path was narrow in places and they navigated it with the ease of long practice, her stepping slightly ahead where the gorse encroached, the wolf dropping back and then drawing level again. The bond had settled the way Dara had said it would, not as a transformation, not as a loss of self, but as a permanent attunement. She knew where he was. She felt his distress when it came, which was less often now and less complete. When she was far from the estate, she felt the pull of it like a tide, not commanding, not painful, simply present, the way homesickness was present. The recognition of somewhere you belonged. Her practice was in the coastal town 20 minutes below Ironcliff. Maritime archives, mostly, historical documents, estate records, the accumulated paper of a coastline that had been keeping records for 400 years. She had been asked twice already if she intended to stay permanently. She had said she did. Cael was still working through the particular difficulty of being happy, which he approached with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He had stopped taking the sedatives 8 months ago, under Dara's supervision, in a process that had been neither easy nor clean and which they had both navigated without pretending otherwise. He was more present now. More present than Nadia suspected he had been in years, perhaps ever. Fully in the room, fully in the conversation, the man and the wolf occupying the same space without one dampening the other. It was not simple. It was not always easy. There were nights when the wolf was close to the surface and the bond pulled in both directions at once, and she had learned to read those nights and to navigate them the way she navigated the sea path, with attention, with patience, with the knowledge of the terrain that only came from having covered it repeatedly. She found she did not mind the large things. She had known this about herself, reading her mother's journals. She had simply needed the occasion to test it. On the cliff above the cove, she stopped. The wolf stopped beside her. Below, the tide was high and the cove was all white water, the sea making its oldest argument against the land. The sky was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge, the first gray becoming the first blue, the stars going out one by one. She put her hand in the wolf's fur, the way she had the first night she'd reached for him, before she understood everything it meant. The wolf's eyes in the lightning sky were entirely amber. He had told her once, in the kitchen on a winter evening, that the amber meant the wolf was at ease. Gray meant alert. The deeper the amber, the less the animal felt it needed to hold itself ready. She had never seen them fully gray since. "Come on," she said. They walked back toward the house together, and the sea went on behind them, and the light came in from the east, and Ironcliff waited at the end of the path with its lamps on against the dark, not the waiting of a house that had stopped trying to look like it cared, but the waiting of a house that knew, now, that someone was coming home. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more epic love stories like this. Comment, where in the world are you watching from?